A leap into the unknown. Nolan adjusted his tie for the third time, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The dark navy suit felt too formal, but he wanted to make a good impression. He exhaled, running a hand through his slightly unkempt brown hair. This wasn't just another diplomatic meeting, this was something far more personal. A date. With an alien. The idea was still surreal, even after years of interspecies relations being a growing reality. Humanity had reached the stars, made allies, and formed bonds across countless worlds. Yet, romantic relationships with non-humans were still a rare, delicate topic. And now he was stepping right into it. He turned away from the mirror and grabbed the invitation message displayed on his holodevice. The sender's name glowed softly. Solara of Veskara. He could still recall their first conversation during the cultural exchange program. He had been assigned as one of Earth's representatives to the Veskaran delegation, eager to strengthen diplomatic ties. The Veskarans were a humanoid species, striking in appearance. Their pale, luminescent skin had a faint silver sheen under certain lighting, and their eyes were larger than a human's, with irises that shimmered like shifting galaxies. Most notably, their long, almost translucent hair moved as if carrying the energy of their emotions. Solara had been particularly hard to read. As a scientist in charge of human compatibility research, she had spent their first meeting meticulously observing him. Every movement he made, every word he spoke, she analyzed it with quiet intensity. When he had jokingly asked if she was studying him like a lab specimen, she had tilted her head and replied, "That is how one best learns, is it not?" Awkward. But fascinating. So, on impulse, Nolan had done something reckless. He had asked her out. A simple offer. A cultural exchange in the most personal way, an interspecies date. He had expected a polite refusal. Instead, she had regarded him with unreadable eyes before saying, "Very well. Let us conduct this date." And now, here he was, preparing for a night that could either be a disaster or the most interesting experience of his life. The meeting. The Veskaran capital was breathtaking. Built along towering cliffs and suspended platforms, the city pulsed with energy lines running beneath its metallic streets, illuminating the walkways with an ethereal glow. The sky shimmered with twin moons, and airships drifted between the skyscrapers like silent sentinels. Nolan stood in front of the designated meeting spot, a restaurant that had been recommended by one of his colleagues. He wasn't even sure if Veskarans ate the same way humans did, but he figured it was a neutral and safe choice. Then, he saw her. Solara approached, wearing what he could only assume was formal Veskaran attire. A sleek, metallic-like fabric wrapped around her shoulders, cascading into a form-fitting dark robe. The material shifted in color as she moved, silver, then deep blue, then a hint of violet. Her hair, always mesmerizing, seemed to catch the light, reflecting a faint glow. Nolan felt completely underdressed. She stopped in front of him, tilting her head slightly. "You wear a binding suit." He blinked. You mean the tie?" She reached out, touching the fabric curiously. "It restricts your throat. Is it a sign of submission?" He let out a small chuckle. "No, just a formal thing. Humans wear it to look professional." Her silver irises flickered. Unusual. But acceptable. Not the strangest start to a date, Nolan thought. Cultural differences. As they sat inside the restaurant, Nolan quickly realized he was in for an unexpected experience. Instead of selecting from a menu, Solara had brought her own recommendation, a series of small glowing orbs. When he hesitated, she explained, "Nutrient spheres. Highly efficient. They dissolve on contact with the tongue." He picked one up skeptically. No offense, but humans usually enjoy food for the taste, not just efficiency. Solara's expression remained neutral. Taste is secondary to survival. He popped one of the orbs into his mouth. The moment it touched his tongue, it dissolved into a burst of flavor, something between citrus and honey, yet strangely cool, like mint. His eyes widened. Okay, that's actually pretty good. She nodded in approval. You have now consumed the equivalent of 3 human meals. Your energy levels will remain stable for 6 hours. He stared at her. So, no dessert? Her lips curled slightly, a Vescaran attempt at a smile. Your humor is noted. He wasn't sure if that was a good or bad thing. Unexpected challenges. Midway through their conversation, Solara suddenly stood. It is time for the trial. Nolan blinked. What trial? She gestured for him to follow. Confused but intrigued, he complied. They exited the restaurant and walked toward an open platform overlooking the city. There, several Vescarans observed an ongoing event, pairs of individuals engaging in a series of fast-paced, precise movements, almost like a mix of martial arts and dance. Solara turned to him. You invited me to this date. As per Vescaran custom, you must now prove your ability to engage in mutual synchronization. His stomach dropped. Wait, you mean I have to do that? She inclined her head. It is the foundation of compatibility. Do you accept? Every part of him screamed that this was a bad idea. He was no athlete, and he definitely wasn't prepared for an alien coordination test. But one look at her composed, expectant face made something stir in him. If he was truly going to experience this, he had to go all in. With a deep breath, he nodded. All right. Let's do this. A trial of movement. The moment he stepped onto the platform, Nolan regretted everything. Solara moved with grace and precision, her every step perfectly calculated. Meanwhile, he felt like an uncoordinated mess trying to keep up. Each movement required him to mirror her, turns, footwork, gestures, even the way their fingers aligned. The Vescaran spectators watched in quiet fascination, their gazes unreadable. Nolan struggled, but he pushed himself, determined not to embarrass himself completely. Then, something shifted. Solara's gaze met his, and he felt an odd sense of connection. Her movements slowed, subtly guiding him rather than expecting him to match her perfectly. For a brief moment, they were in sync. And when the trial ended, the Vescaran observers let out a collective hum, a sign of acknowledgement. Solara turned to him, her expression unreadable. You did not fail. He let out a breathless laugh. That's the nicest way I've ever been told I'm terrible at something. Her lips twitched, the closest thing to amusement he had seen from her. You are persistent. I value that. For some reason, that meant more to him than any compliment he had ever received. A date, or something more? As they walked away from the trial, Nolan felt an unexpected warmth between them. The barriers of misunderstanding, the initial awkwardness, it had all led to this moment. He glanced at her. So, do I get to ask for a second date? Solara regarded him with unreadable eyes before responding. A second date is not merely an extension of the first. Among my people, it is a declaration. His heart skipped a beat. A declaration of what? She stepped closer, her silver eyes reflecting the lights of the city. That you intend to see this through. Nolan swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what he had just signed up for. But something told him, this was only the beginning. Deeper into the unknown. Nolan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the blinking message on his hollow device. If you wish to proceed with the second date, you must prepare. Solara's words were brief, as always, but they carried weight. He was quickly learning that Vescaran customs had layers, hidden expectations and deep-rooted traditions. This wasn't just another casual outing. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. What exactly did prepare mean? It wasn't like he could just Google how to date an alien woman. Well, he could, but something told him interspecies romance blogs weren't going to cover this particular situation. Still, he had made his choice. Whatever this was, whatever she was inviting him into, he was going to see it through. Preparations and uncertainty. The next morning, Nolan contacted Commander Eston, one of the few humans who had spent years embedded in Vescaran culture. The older man appeared on the holocall, his grizzled face creasing into a knowing smirk. "So, you went on a date with a Vescaran, huh?" Nolan sighed. "Yeah. And now I have no idea what I've gotten myself into." Eston chuckled. "Son, you're already in deeper than you realize. If she's asking for a second date, that means she's testing you." Nolan frowned. "Testing me how?" "Vescarans don't do casual relationships. Everything is about proving compatibility, intellect, physicality, emotional resilience. If she's inviting you back, she's gauging whether you're worth investing in." Nolan swallowed. "That sounds intense." Eston shrugged. "It is. But if you impress her, you might just be in for something incredible." That didn't make him feel much better, but it did make him more determined. "So, how do I prepare?" The commander's smirk widened. "You train. A lesson in control." Hours later, Nolan stood in a Vescaran training hall, facing a wall of shimmering energy. The room was empty except for him and Solara. She regarded him with calm detachment. "You struggle with synchronization. This will teach you control." He sighed. "You know, humans don't usually have to train for second dates." She tilted her head. "Humans also do not have our traditions." "Fair point." She gestured toward the energy wall. "This field will shift its form. Your goal is simple: move as it moves. Do not resist. Do not anticipate. Simply follow." Nolan watched as the wall pulsed, rippling like liquid light. He stepped forward hesitantly. The moment he made contact, it was like the wall had a mind of its own. It pushed, twisted, and pulled in unexpected directions. Nolan gritted his teeth, trying to move with it, but every instinct in his body fought against the unnatural sensation. Within seconds, he stumbled backward, breathless. "That is not easy." Solara observed him. "You think too much. Stop trying to predict, react instead." Easier said than done. But Nolan wasn't one to back down from a challenge. Again and again, he stepped into the energy field. Each time, he lasted a little longer before losing his balance. Hours passed. Sweat dripped down his back, his muscles burned, and frustration clawed at his mind. Finally, on his last attempt, something clicked. He stopped resisting. Instead of fighting the movement, he allowed himself to flow with it. His steps adjusted naturally, his breath steadied, and suddenly, he was moving as one with the energy. Solara's silver eyes flickered with something close to approval. Better. For the first time that day, Nolan felt like he was actually making progress. The second date, Vescaran style. When the day of the second date arrived, Nolan was led deep into the heart of the Vescaran city. Unlike their first outing, which had been relatively controlled, this location was different, untamed and wild. He found himself standing at the edge of a vast canyon, wind whipping through his hair. Floating platforms hovered across the deep ravine, shifting slightly as if reacting to some unseen force. Solara stood beside him, her long, glowing hair catching the light. "You have trained. Now, we cross." Nolan stared at her. "Cross? You mean, jump across floating rocks in midair?" She nodded as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "It will test your adaptability. If we succeed, we will share the victory." He wasn't sure what sharing a victory meant, but he had a feeling it was important. Taking a deep breath, he stepped onto the first platform. It wobbled beneath him, but he remembered the training: don't resist, just move. Solara leaped effortlessly onto the next one, her movements fluid. Nolan followed, his heart pounding. He landed slightly off-center, and the platform dipped dangerously. For a moment, panic gripped him. Then he forced himself to let go. As they continued forward, his movements became steadier. He mirrored Solara's rhythm, adjusting in real time. By the time they reached the other side, something had shifted between them. Solara turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You learn quickly." He smirked, still catching his breath. "Good teacher." She regarded him for a long moment before stepping closer. "You asked what a second date meant to my people." He nodded. "It is an invitation to continue forward. To trust. To see if something deeper is possible." Her words carried weight, more than he expected. And for the first time since this started, Nolan realized. He wanted to see where this could go. A test of trust. Nolan stood in the dimly lit chamber, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. He had come this far, but he knew, this wasn't just a date anymore. Vescarans had a way of turning everything into a test, and Solara had just made it clear, this second date was an invitation to something more. But what exactly did that mean? He glanced at Solara, who stood a few feet away, her silver eyes glowing faintly in the low light. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged with something he couldn't quite name. Then, without warning, she spoke. "Tonight, we take the next step." His stomach tightened. "And what exactly is the next step?" She studied him for a long moment before finally answering. "Trust. The ritual of binding." Nolan followed Solara through a series of underground corridors. The deeper they went, the cooler the air became. The walls, once smooth and metallic, gave way to ancient stone etched with symbols that pulsed faintly with energy. Eventually, they entered a vast chamber. In the center stood a circular platform surrounded by glowing crystalline structures. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through his chest. A group of Vescarans waited for them, their armor gleaming under the ethereal light. Unlike Solara, who had always carried an air of quiet confidence, these warriors exuded raw intensity. One of them stepped forward. His presence commanded attention, broad-shouldered, taller than the rest, with piercing violet eyes that locked onto Nolan. Solara spoke first. "This is Commander Veclan. He will oversee the ritual." Nolan blinked. "Ritual?" Veclan studied him. "A human enters the sacred trials?" His tone wasn't hostile, but there was skepticism in his voice. Solara didn't waver. "He has earned the right." Veclan arched a brow but nodded. "Very well. Let the test begin." "Test? Oh, great." Nolan barely had time to react before the platform beneath him lit up. Trial of Shadows. The moment the light engulfed him, the world shifted. He found himself standing in a vast expanse of nothingness. The chamber, the Vescarans, everything had disappeared. Then, from the darkness, shapes began to emerge. At first, they were just flickering figures, like shadows cast on a wall. But then they took form, human forms. And Nolan's breath caught in his throat. Because he recognized them. His father. His younger brother. His old squad from the military. But something was wrong. Their faces were twisted in expressions of pain, their eyes hollow and accusing. A cold, sharp voice echoed around him. "You failed us." His pulse pounded. "No, this isn't real." The figures stepped closer, their eyes boring into him. "You left us behind." He stumbled back, shaking his head. "That's not true." But was it? Regret had been his constant companion for years. The choices he had made, the lives he couldn't save, the past never truly left him. You don't belong here. The voices grew louder, pressing against his mind. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to drown them out. But they weren't just voices. They were his own thoughts, his own guilt, amplified and relentless. Then, through the storm of voices, another sound emerged. A single word. Nolan. His eyes snapped open. Solara stood before him, her silver eyes locked onto his. She wasn't glowing like the figures around him. She wasn't twisted into some nightmare version of herself. She was real. Come back. Her voice was steady, an anchor in the chaos. And suddenly, he understood. The trial wasn't about fighting. It wasn't about winning. It was about trusting someone else to pull you through the darkness. He reached for her. The moment their hands touched, the shadows vanished. The aftermath. Nolan stumbled forward, gasping as reality snapped back into place. The chamber reappeared, the Vescaran warriors still standing in their formation. His hands were shaking. His breath came fast. Solara stood beside him, her expression unreadable. Veclan studied them both before finally speaking. He passed. There was a murmur among the warriors, some surprised, others approving. Solara turned to Nolan. You are not Vescaran. Yet you faced your own mind and found your way back. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. I told you this was about trust. And tonight, you proved you are willing to trust me. He swallowed hard, nodding. I did. Then, to his complete surprise, she reached up and pressed her forehead gently against his. A Vescaran gesture of deep respect, and something more. Nolan didn't know what would come next. But he knew one thing for sure, he wasn't turning back now. A bond deeper than words. Nolan had faced battles, endured loss, and pushed through the worst of humanity's wars. Yet standing in that Vescaran chamber, surrounded by warriors who still weren't sure whether he belonged, he realized something strange, he wasn't afraid. Solara had called this a test of trust, but it had felt like more than that. She had reached into the depths of his mind, pulled him back from his own guilt and regrets. That wasn't just a test. That was something deeper. He turned to her, eyes searching for answers. What happens now? She held his gaze for a moment before replying. Now, we move forward. That sounded simple. But nothing about this night had been simple. The meaning of the ritual. The Vescaran warriors slowly began to disperse, though not without lingering glances in Nolan's direction. He didn't know if they looked at him with respect or suspicion. Maybe both. Veclan approached, his violet eyes still holding the same sharpness. You have taken part in something few outsiders have. This ritual is not just about trust, it is about bonding. It is sacred. Nolan frowned. Bonding? Solara inhaled, as if preparing for something heavy. Among our people, this ritual is often performed between those who seek to form an unbreakable connection. Nolan blinked. Wait, what? Veclan gave a rare smirk. I wonder if he truly understood what he agreed to. Solara shot the commander a look before turning back to Nolan. This does not mean what you think it does. He crossed his arms. Then explain it to me, because it sounds like I just walked into some kind of a Vescaran marriage ritual or something. Solara's lips twitched, as if she were holding back a laugh. It is not a marriage. But it is a deep connection. A Vescaran does not offer trust lightly. To complete this ritual means that you and I are now bound in a way that cannot be undone easily. The weight of her words settled over him. Bound. Nolan wasn't sure what to say to that. Return to the city. As they left the underground chamber and stepped back into the night air of the Vescaran city, Nolan exhaled. The city was alive with neon lights and the faint hum of anti-gravity vehicles weaving through the skyline. Solara led him through the winding streets, away from the ceremonial halls, toward a quieter part of the city. Finally, she stopped near a bridge overlooking a river that shimmered with soft blue bioluminescence. She turned to him. "You are troubled." He let out a dry laugh. "Can you blame me? I came here expecting a second date. Instead, I went through a trial, confronted my demons, and somehow ended up bonded to you." Her silver eyes studied him. "Does this displease you?" He hesitated. The truth was, it didn't. It scared him, sure. But it didn't feel wrong. And that was what unsettled him the most. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. It's just, unexpected. But I meant it when I said I trusted you, Solara." Her expression softened, just a little. "Good. Because trust is only the beginning." An unexpected warning. The moment was interrupted by the soft chime of a communicator on Solara's wrist. She glanced down, and her expression shifted instantly. Nolan immediately knew something was wrong. "What is it?" She didn't answer at first. Instead, she pressed a button, and a small holographic projection appeared in front of them. A Vescaran officer's face flickered into view. "Solara, you must return immediately. There has been a development." She stiffened. "What kind of development?" The officer hesitated. "The human's presence has drawn attention. There are those who do not believe he should have taken part in the ritual. Some are calling for action." Nolan's jaw clenched. "Let me guess, not the good kind of action?" The officer's gaze flickered to Nolan before looking back at Solara. "You need to come back to the high chambers. Now." The transmission cut out. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Nolan exhaled. "Well. That didn't take long." Solara's face was unreadable. "I expected resistance. But not this quickly." He smirked. "Guess I make an impression." She didn't laugh. Instead, she turned toward him, and for the first time since he had met her, he saw something close to fear in her expression. "Nolan, listen to me. There are those among my people who believe humans are not worthy of Vescaran trust. You entering the ritual, it challenges their beliefs." His expression hardened. "And they don't like being challenged." She nodded. He straightened. "Well, if they want to talk, let's talk." But Solara's hand shot out, gripping his wrist. "No. This is not just talk. If they see you as a threat, they may move against you. And against me." Nolan stared at her. And that's when he realized, this wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about an outsider breaking tradition. Solara had put herself on the line for him. He met her gaze, his voice quiet but firm. "Then let's face them together." She hesitated, then gave a single nod. And together, they turned back toward the heart of the city, toward whatever awaited them next. Enemies in the shadows. Nolan had faced battlefields before. He had been trained in war, seen the worst of humanity, and survived against impossible odds. But as he followed Solara through the winding Vescaran city streets, past glowing towers and shadowed alleys, he knew this was different. This wasn't a war fought with guns and ships. This was a war of beliefs. And he had unknowingly placed himself at the center of it. The High Chambers. The Vescaran High Chambers loomed before them, an imposing structure made of obsidian-like metal, with intricate blue symbols carved into its surface. Guards lined the entrance, their silver armor gleaming under the artificial city lights. Solara walked ahead of him, her posture tense. Nolan could see the weight pressing on her shoulders. This wasn't just about him, it was about her standing in her own society. As they stepped inside, the grand hall stretched out before them, lined with Vescaran leaders seated in a semicircle. At the center stood Veclan, his piercing violet eyes unreadable. Solara stopped, her voice steady. "You called us here." "We have come." Veclan nodded but did not look at her. His gaze was locked on Nolan. "You have disrupted our traditions, human. There are those who do not accept what has happened." Nolan crossed his arms. "And what does that mean, exactly?" One of the other Vescaran council members, a tall, severe-looking man named Ralvik, spoke. "It means there are consequences for breaking sacred customs." Solara stepped forward. "He did not break them. He honored them. The ritual was accepted by the spirits, by our ancestors." "Are you saying their judgment is flawed?" Murmurs rippled through the room. Ralvik's gaze hardened. "I am saying that outsiders do not belong among us." Nolan clenched his jaw. "Then why invite me at all?" Veclan raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. "Enough. We are not here to argue in circles. There are two options before us. 1. This human leaves Vescaran space immediately, never to return." Solara stiffened. "And the second?" Veclan exhaled. "He proves himself. In our way. The trial." Nolan wasn't sure what he expected. Maybe some kind of debate, maybe another ritual. He hadn't expected a fight to the death. They stood in an underground arena, dimly lit by glowing veins of blue crystal. The air was thick with tension. Vescaran warriors lined the outer walls, watching. Waiting. Across from Nolan stood a Vescaran fighter in full battle armor. His opponent's name was Karan, a veteran warrior, taller and heavier than Nolan by a good margin. His deep red skin bore old scars, and his glowing amber eyes held nothing but contempt. Solara stood beside Nolan, her voice low. "You do not have to do this." He smirked. "Pretty sure I do." Her silver eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Karan is a seasoned warrior. He has fought in countless battles. This is not a fair fight." Nolan rolled his shoulders. "Life isn't fair." A deep voice echoed through the arena. "Begin." Karan lunged. Nolan barely had time to react before the Vescaran warrior was upon him, swinging a heavy blade meant to cleave him in half. He dodged, rolling to the side as the weapon struck the ground with a thunderous impact. He wasn't armed. Karan was. And that meant he had to fight smart. The Vescaran warrior came at him again, faster than his size suggested. Nolan sidestepped, grabbing a loose piece of stone and hurling it into Karan's face. The warrior snarled, momentarily blinded. Nolan used the opening. He drove his elbow into Karan's ribs, then followed with a sharp kick to the knee. The larger warrior stumbled, but barely. Then Karan backhanded him. Pain exploded in Nolan's skull as he hit the ground. His vision blurred for a moment. He barely had time to roll before a blade sank into the floor where his head had been. The crowd roared. Nolan pushed himself up, breathing hard. He could already feel the bruise forming along his jaw. Karan turned toward him, smiling. "You are weak, human. You do not belong here." Nolan spat blood. "Funny. That's exactly what people used to tell me back home." Then he moved. Not backward, forward. He surged toward Karan, dodging another swing of the blade and slamming his fist into the warrior's throat. The Vescaran stumbled, coughing. Nolan didn't let up. He drove his knee into Karan's gut, grabbed the warrior's arm, and twisted, hard. The blade fell from Karan's grip. In a heartbeat, Nolan had the weapon in his hands. The crowd went silent. Karan stared at him, breathing hard. "Finish it." Nolan stood over him, blade poised. He could end this right now. Prove himself. But instead, he threw the weapon aside. No. Murmurs spread through the arena. Karan looked stunned. Nolan turned to the council members watching from above. I didn't come here to kill for your approval. If this is your test, then I reject it. I won't be part of another meaningless war. You want proof that I belong? I just beat your best fighter without a weapon. That should be enough. Silence. Then, Veclan laughed. The old commander stepped forward, clapping slowly. Impressive. You understand strength, yet refuse senseless bloodshed. Perhaps there is hope for you after all. Ralvik looked furious. This is unacceptable. He must. Veclan raised a hand. The trial is over. He has passed. Shifting tides. Nolan sat on the balcony of Solara's home, watching the distant lights of the city. His body ached, but the adrenaline had worn off. He was just tired. Solara sat beside him, quiet for a long time. Then, softly, she said, "You surprised them today." He let out a dry chuckle. Surprised myself, too. She turned to him. You did not have to spare Karan. He met her gaze. Yeah, I did. Because if I killed him, I would have just proven them right. That humans are just killers. That I'm no different from the ones who came before me. Solara studied him. And yet, you still fight. He smirked. I fight for the things that matter. For a moment, she was silent. Then, very softly, she said, I am beginning to think, you matter, Nolan. His breath caught. For the first time, he saw something in her eyes that wasn't just duty or honor. Something real. And that was more terrifying than any battle he had ever faced.